So yeah, it's good to be back, Anya.
Yeah, well, especially good considering you just went back to Beirut. We said goodbye to you a few weeks ago, about a month ago actually, when you were
Yeah.
leaving DC. And I mean, it was already difficult enough. I know you were talking
Yeah.
about being there and how it just wasn't the same. Life was getting so difficult because of the economic situation, but you could have never imagined that your return to DC was going to be spurred by this
Yeah.
devastating man made disaster. I'm so glad you're
Just
okay.
awful.
I know all of our viewers are too. Fortunately, when I woke up, you had already messaged me quite a bit, so I knew you were okay. Otherwise, that would have been my first thought. Take us back to that day and what was going on for you.
Yeah, so I was really lucky because I was not injured. I mean, this blast like impacted the entire city. It was so widespread. Like, I've been to Syria and Iraq, and I've seen, like you've seen as well, in Syria, like neighborhoods that are destroyed from war. But it usually takes like a few years for that to happen. It happens gradually over time. This was in the course of like a minute that the entire city of Beirut was damaged and just like looked like a war zone. You've been to my apartment there. Uh, I was at my apartment earlier in the day, and then the power cut because like there was these like 20-hour long power cuts because of a fuel crisis that was taking place about a month ago. Uh, that had to do with like mismanagement with the government as well as a shortage in fuel due linked to the economic issue. Anyway, so there's fuel shortages and a crisis. So these power outages, like it's really hot in Beirut in the summertime. It's almost as hot as DC. So like you need to be in AC. So I was like, I can't work right now. I can't work without electricity. So I went over to my friend's apartment because she had generator electricity. And that's the only reason I wasn't at my apartment. And so me and her were working. We were like in her living room, and then the building started shaking like an earthquake, which I've never experienced before. So that was like really terrifying, because it was just shaking a lot. And then like a few seconds later, just every window in the apartment blew open, and this like blast of pressure just like kind of pushed everyone over. Um, and and then after that, like a few seconds later, there was just massive explosive sound because the sound makes it there a little bit later. And we were all like freaking out. It was me and two of my friends. We were freaking out. We were like, what the hell just happened? A lot of people, because of Lebanon's recent history, thought like one of two things: either this was a car bomb, because like a few years ago there was car bomb assassinations uh, were not infrequent. Or did maybe the Israelis just bomb? That was like the first two things on people's minds. But then, about 30 minutes prior to that, we'd heard that there was a fire at the port. And we really didn't think anything of it. And then when we went outside, after we weren't like scared there was going to be like some other explosion, there was this plume of like pink and red smoke in the air coming from the direction of the port. So it was clearly linked to that. And then eventually we went down to the street, and like that's when you saw how widespread the damage was, because it was just like every building was impacted. There was just like this, glass everywhere. Like it looked like it had like rained glass outside. There was just piles of it in the street. And so, then I went back to my own apartment to check the damage, and I'm really lucky I wasn't there because the like the glass inside the apartment, inside like one of the doors in the apartment, just like shattered everywhere. Like just big and small pieces of it like flew across the room. And were all over my workstation. So like had I been there, I would have been like severely injured or worse. I'm really lucky I wasn't there, thanks to the power cuts I had been complaining about incessantly. And then I got a chance to go see one of the hospitals because I went to go check on a friend who was injured, and the hospital was just so chaotic. Like the injuries were crazy because basically like this blast not only broke the glass, if you were closer to the port, it like broke your entire house and made all your furniture fly around and break and fall over. So people were like smashed by furniture. They had broken bones. They had puncture wounds, like they'd been punctured with furniture or with glass, big shards of glass. There was like there's a lot of amputations from this. Just really, really, really awful, crazy injuries on a massive scale because it was the whole city. And also the areas I was in was lucky because there was like these wheat silos at the port that had absorbed some of the shock, and they were like in between like where I was and where the port is. So the area I was in luckily was got away with less damage because of that. But like the other areas of the city, especially the ones in the closest proximity to that port, I have so many friends who lost their entire homes. Like their entire apartment is just gone. Everything they owned is broken and destroyed. Like they were lucky to get away with just a few injuries. It was just, I mean, it was really like, I cannot describe to you, I can't really convey in words just how widespread and all across the city the devastation was. And ultimately, like, it's really catastrophic for Lebanon because this is an import dependent country. Lebanon imports 80% of what it consumes, which is a high, shockingly high, even for like a developing country. And Lebanon also produces almost nothing. It has like no productive capacity. Lebanon's economy was all based on banking, which was crashing over the last year. So this is a country that's completely dependent on imports for its basic survival. And this Beirut port, was the biggest port in the country. 80% to 85% of what was imported into Lebanon came through the Beirut port. And that's now gone. And there's no alternative to it. There's like a smaller port up north in Tripoli, but it only has the capacity of 25 to 40% of what the Beirut port does. So you're talking about also everything that was at this port was like destroyed. All the medical supplies that was there, all the food that was there is gone. All the pharmaceuticals that were there. So in the long term, in the near term and the long term, this is going to be really bad for Lebanon. In terms of just basic necessities. And in the long term, nobody's going to rebuild this. There's countries offering aid right now, but it's very little. It's not enough to rebuild an entire port that has the capacity of what the Beirut port had. And we can go more into the economic problems that Lebanon was facing before this, but it's really bad. It's really, really bad.
Because they would need a port to rebuild.
Right, exactly. To even get the supplies in, right? And also it's important to mention that Lebanon is sandwiched in between Syria and Israel, and then its coastline. So it can't do any trade with Israel because Israel is an official enemy that attacks it every few years. That's not an option. And it can't really trade with Syria because even though it shares a very long land border and it's its neighbor, because of U.S. sanctions. The latest Caesar sanctions that went into effect last month or 2 months ago, I can't remember, are just the latest really draconian sanctions among many. But these ones actually sanction anyone from any country that does trade or business with Syria. And that doesn't just include the Syrian government, that includes even just Syrian private businesses. So that means a Lebanese business person or the Lebanese government will face sanctions if they do any business with Syria. It would be like if another country came to the US and said, we'll sanction you if you do trade with Mexico or Canada. It's insane and arrogant and crazy that the US can even do that. But that stops Lebanon from being able to trade with Syria. So Lebanon's only gateway for trade with the outside world was the Beirut port. And now that's gone. And this came on top of a really severe economic crisis that started back last year. It began around September. Lebanon has this Ponzi scheme economy that's been in place since the 90s. That was actually put in place. The architects of it were America's greatest allies in Lebanon. They built this Ponzi scheme economy that's largely responsible for the widespread corruption in the country that led to this explosion. And they made massive amounts of money off of it. But it all came crashing down last year when people woke up to the fact that it was a Ponzi scheme and investors started pulling their money out of the Lebanese banking system. And, Lebanon, I guess you could say before last year, before the economic collapse, even though it's a third world country, it had a big middle class. It was almost like a middle income third world country with a pretty big middle class that had money and was able to take vacations, owned their own homes, were able to put their kids in like private school, and like were professionals and educated. And in the course of a year, the Lebanese currency has devalued, but because of this economic crisis, by 80%, and we're headed towards hyperinflation. The unemployment rate has skyrocketed even before the COVID-19 lockdown that Lebanon had to implement because it has such a weak healthcare system that had there been a surge in Lebanon, it would have completely collapsed. So they implemented a lockdown that just sped up the economic collapse and caused like widespread job loss that was already happening. So the unemployment rate is like on its way to 50%. And people's life savings because of the devaluation of the currency has been like wiped out. So overnight, people went from being middle class to being poor across the country and having trouble affording food because now the price of food is like 5 times what it was yesterday. So it's a really terrible situation Lebanon was in before this port explosion. And this was just like, that's what I say it's catastrophic. And Lebanon's not just any country, right? It's a country that's always in political turmoil because it has a resistance group that like called Hezbollah that came into existence to resist Israel and push Israel out of southern Lebanon, which it used to occupy, and then played a significant role in beating off the jihadis that the U.S. armed and funded in Syria that actually came into Lebanon. Like 3 years ago, Hezbollah was at the forefront of pushing those people out of Lebanon, and also was like the shock troops for the Syrian government in stopping and preventing state collapse to ISIS and Al Qaeda. So that's been, for that reason, they're a thorn in the side of the U.S. on top of being a deterrent to Israeli aggression. Mm-hmm. So because of Hezbollah's existence in Lebanon, the U.S. has its hands in there, like constantly trying to puppeteer its own region, its own like local proxies to do its bidding, which causes constant political turmoil in Lebanon. So that's happening on top of all this. It's like a really messed up situation.
Yeah, and you said people, when we talked about this a few days ago, you said that when it first happened, people were so shocked and shaken that they weren't even really thinking about what happened or asking the greater political questions, which of course is immediately what people in the US and online started to do. There was a lot of speculation. Obviously, people were suspicious that Israel or the United States would perhaps have something to do with this. And I wanted to turn to a comment and also encourage people to comment and ask questions. That's the point of doing the live. If you have questions for Rania, please send them. But someone said that they were disappointed to see Grayzone immediately picked up the official narrative of this story and went with it. Most of Lebanon's food destroyed as U.S. torches Syrian wheat. Coordinated genocide. Rania, a lot of people wanting to point blame at the United States and Israel for this, but what is your take there? Do you think that it is worth questioning the official narrative?
Well, anything is possible, but from the people I've spoken to, people who are close to Hezbollah, the general security in Lebanon, they do believe that this was started by an accident, which is, I think, very likely. There's always, of course, someone may have done this out of sabotage, started a fire knowing there was ammonium nitrate near it. But the reason I think that's unlikely is because no one really benefits from that. Like, this destroyed the entire city. It didn't destroy one political party, and it didn't really necessarily benefit anyone. So I just don't see the strategic value in blowing up Beirut. On top of that, there's a paper trail of the government being warned about the improper storage of this ammonium nitrate. And Lebanon has a really dysfunctional, weak central state, and that's intentional. That's the way the country was set up in the 90s. It's meant to be an intentionally weak state set up by allocating power through sects, so people can't identify as Lebanese. They identify as like whatever their sect is and whoever their political party affiliation is. And there's just corruption and nepotism and patronage that's embedded into that system that leads to dysfunctional bureaucracy. So it's really like easy to understand how this could have happened given the conditions uh, in Lebanon's like system of governance. It's very easy to believe that this was a case of criminally negligent and incompetent governance. That said, like nothing should be ruled out and there should be like a proper investigation. But also, it's important to take into account that Israel came out and denied it immediately. When Israel does something, even if they don't admit to it, they like want you to know they did it. You know, like with those explosions in Iran, the Israelis aren't like jumping up and down to deny it. They're not admitting it, but they kind of want you to believe they did it. You know what I mean? So that's important to take into account as well. That said, like, I mean, we'll never know until there's an investigation, but I just don't think like Israel did this. I think this was like a self-inflicted wound. At most, there might have been some sabotage involved, but that's like pure speculation. There's no evidence for that. That said, even if the Israelis were behind this, or like, even if there was some sort of attempt to sabotage, why was there 2,750 tons of an explosive fertilizer being stored at the most densely populated city in the country, in the most important port in the country? Like, it was like a ticking time bomb. You know, there's like so much, you know, and there's every 6 months someone was warning, this is really dangerous. This is really dangerous. And the Lebanese state is so weak and so incapable of moving on anything that nobody intervened to do anything about it. Instead, people were kind of bickering over how they could make a profit off of it. Like, that's very Lebanon. And so that's why there's so much anger at the power structure in Lebanon right now. And what's infuriating is the way that the U.S. and its allies have tried to take advantage and exploit that anger, much like they did last year in October, when there was like initially an uprising against corruption in the country. Within days, it was hijacked by American allies inside the country who tried to turn it against Hezbollah. And that's exactly what you're seeing now. And it's also important to note that the areas that were most badly impacted are those that were in closest proximity to the port. And those areas are like Christian areas that have a constituency that belongs to right-wing pro-American political parties. So a lot of the anger, the angriest people that are in the streets in Beirut and Lebanon are those who were most badly impacted, and they have like a certain politics that comes with that. So their almost instinctive reaction is to say it's Hezbollah's fault because of the constituency that they're a part of. So like when you saw these images of like the French president Macron going to Beirut and being embraced, it was because he was going to the neighborhoods most badly impacted, and those happened to be Christian neighborhoods that in Lebanon, they like see themselves as French. They even speak French more than they speak Arabic. So it's important to understand that when you see Western images of like the aftermath and the protests and the angriest people, the angriest constituency has like a certain, like there's a politics that comes behind that, and it's anti-Hezbollah and pro-American and like French, please come take us back and be our colonial daddy again.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to draw attention to, a comment from Jason Solo. He said, "Hey ladies, first time catching your show live. One of the sickest things about this situation in Lebanon is how the US, Israel, France, etc. are trying to use this terrible tragedy. Macron has said he's helping develop a plan for Lebanon as though it's his place. Do we know more specifically how France is trying to use the situation? And then if you can get into the politics, because I know the Lebanese politics is very complicated. There are lots of competing sects, and I don't think people here really have an idea of how that functions."
So the French role in Lebanon isn't black and white, because sometimes they play a constructive role. They're kind of sometimes a lot of times they end up playing referee between the U.S. and the parties in Lebanon that the U.S. hates, or at least trying to prevent the U.S. from doing the worst. France has this like weird, like parental sentiment when it comes to Lebanon, as they do with a lot of their former colonies, where they don't want to see it collapse. Um, so the French agenda in Lebanon isn't like state collapse. Like the US agenda right now seems to be state collapse. The French want to prevent that, as do a lot of European countries, because they bear the brunt of the refugees that end up leaving the Middle East when another state collapses. So when it comes to Lebanon, there's also Syrian refugees in Lebanon, a lot of them who these European governments don't want coming to their countries because they don't want more refugees. That said, like, I'm not saying France is good here, but I don't know exactly what the French government, like what Macron has planned. But in the past, it's been like it's like a roll of the dice. Like obviously they have pro-Western allies in Lebanon who they're allied with who are anti-Hezbollah. But France has been an advocate against implementing maximum pressure on Lebanon, which is what the US wants to do. I think it's more important to look at what the US has planned for Lebanon because that's far more destructive. And what we know now is we see this Wall Street Journal article talking to US officials who are like giddy at the prospect of implementing fresh sanctions, not just on Hezbollah, who's already under sanction by Lebanon, but also any politician that allies with Hezbollah. So the Free Patriotic Movement and the ML movement are two political parties that are a part of Hezbollah's majority coalition in parliament. 2 years ago, Hezbollah won a significant number of seats in the parliament, not a majority, but a significant number for their party. And they became a part of a majority coalition in the parliament. And ever since then, because the US loves democracy so much, they have been threatening and there's been people lobbying, particularly pro-Israel organizations, lobbying the US government to sanction these parties that are allied with Hezbollah. In the government, they call it a Hezbollah government. Now it seems the US is prepared to use this catastrophe to not lend a helping hand in a time of crisis. It's like Lebanon's 9/11 mixed with like a hurricane, but rather to tighten the noose, as they like to say, by sanctioning more politicians in the country to try to weaken the government and force Hezbollah out. So that's, I think, what's more important to recognize. And they're doing it by also not just threatening their sanctions, but they have parties that are allied with them. That's the Lebanese Forces, which is a right-wing party that was a militia. All these parties I'm mentioning, by the way, were militias during the Civil War. And their leaders were like sectarian warlords during the Civil War. And that includes those parties that are allied with Hezbollah. But the ones who are against Hezbollah are the Future Movement, headed by Saad Hariri, the Progressive Socialist Party, which is neither progressive nor socialist, headed by Walid Jumblat, and the Lebanese Forces, headed by Samir Jaja. There's a couple more, but those are like the main ones. And they're allied with the US and Saudi Arabia, and they're constantly trying to undermine the government and undermine Hezbollah and basically do America's bidding. And so like they represent a significant portion of the country. Like Lebanon's a really polarized country where I would estimate that probably half the country would love to, throw the Palestinians into the sea and make peace with Israel tomorrow. And I don't say that lightly. That's the anti-Hezbollah side. That's their agenda. The pro-Hezbollah side is pro-resistance, wants to be closer to Iran, wants to be closer to the East, wants to be embraced by China and says, screw the US. All they do is meddle in our country and try and destabilize our government and make it impossible for like us to have normal lives and a normal economy. And so there's like a significant tension in Lebanon because there's this cliche, like all these Western journalists like to say Lebanon is where East meets West. But in a way, it kind of is in the sense that like those tensions of East and West, China, Iran on one side, US, Israel on the other, really are like, at war in Lebanon. Mm-hmm. And those tensions are constantly behind, the political instability of that country. And it's always on the precipice of war because of that.
Yeah. I'm wondering if you could answer this because I've seen at least two people ask this question so far. What is the role of the Lebanese Communist Party, if any, in the system?
So I have a lot of friends in the Lebanese Communist Party, and they're great. I don't like, I like them, but and they probably, I don't want this to come off the wrong way, but they don't have any power. Actually, they would agree with me about that. They don't have any power. They don't have anyone in government. Um, they don't have like a significant constituency. Sadly, the left is not a power player at all in Lebanon. They want to increase their power, but ever since the fall of the Soviet Union, leftist parties haven't had any backing. You need resources to be able to create a constituency. And sadly, Lebanon, those resources don't exist for the left. So the Lebanese Communist Party is active on the ground. It's active in protests. It's active in organizing as much as it can, but it's not large, and it just doesn't have any power in government at all. They run in elections and stuff, but they don't win. The people that win are the people with resources. The people who have resources and have a constituency are funded by Saudi Arabia. Well, they used to be, at least. Saudi hasn't really been funding people as much anymore. Or they have the backing of the US, and they're like oligarchs with billions of dollars. Or, in the case of Hezbollah, they have the backing of Iran. They're partners with Iran, but they also have a constituency because they fought for the country, right? Like Hezbollah has a constituency not because it has money to pay people like some other parties do to come out and vote for them, but because people believe in them and their cause of protecting Lebanon's sovereignty. And they do it. Like Hezbollah has the blood to show for it, right? Like they actually fight for the country. They fight and die for it, protecting the country from Israel and from threats that came from Syria. So anyways, the point is to say that the Lebanese Communist Party isn't so much of an active player right now, except for being, participating in protests. And I should specify, like, when I talk about these protests that, end up turning anti-Hezbollah, there also are, progressive and leftist forces that do participate in protests and try to, like, redirect it from the political hijacking toward a more equitable society. But they just don't have a media outlet they don't have a megaphone for that. They don't, like, Lebanon's a country where every party has a media outlet, you know what I mean? To get their narrative out. Like the leftists and progressives don't have that. So it's not an easy country to be like a leftist in, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. Someone else asked, why doesn't Lebanon follow Syria's lead and look to Russia for assistance and support?
I mean, Russia's not offering assistance. Like Russia offers rhetorical support, but Russia isn't like a wealthy country. They have their own economic problems right now. Russia's support for Syria is not monetary. Russia's support for Syria was military. Lebanon doesn't need military support. Lebanon needs financial support. So Russia's not really the place to look to for that.
And what about China? Does China have any influence whatsoever in Lebanon?
China has a huge opportunity to have influence, but they so far haven't offered anything. Like China does do a lot of infrastructure projects in countries in third world countries for its Belt and Road Initiative. And Lebanon could be useful for that. However, you need like a functioning government that you can work with to be able to do infrastructure projects. Sadly, in Lebanon, like if I was China, I wouldn't know who to work with. Like what government do you work with? Like everyone in the government steals from the public coffers, like billions and billions of dollars it's unbelievable how much money has been invested into the electricity sector in Lebanon. Yet you remember, Anya, when you came and stayed with me 3 hours, and that was last year, 3 hours a day, the state electricity would shut off and we'd have to depend on a building generator. Like that's despite billions of dollars being invested into the electricity sector. It's not a big country. It's not hard to provide electricity. That is because people responsible for the electricity sector stole money. Like that's how Lebanon functions. So for a country like China, who's serious about investing in infrastructure, like you need a government to work with who's not going to steal the money and pocket it. You know what I'm saying? So that's actually one of the biggest obstacles to China, I think, investing in Lebanon. On top of that, if China were to invest in Lebanon, the U.S. would immediately jump in and say no. We saw a few months ago as the economic crisis in Lebanon increased or was like accelerating, there was like rumors that the Chinese might invest, like Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, gave one of his speeches and talked about, possible investment from China. And China hadn't even offered anything. But the U.S. and Mike Pompeo like immediately started making statements. The U.S. embassy, the U.S. ambassador started making statements. All these like Middle East officials started making statements about how like Lebanon better not make a deal with China. China needs to stay out of Lebanon and stop trying to interfere. And so like if China really did try to invest, the U.S. would be a huge obstacle to that, as well as the U.S.'s allies on the ground in Lebanon would say absolutely not. And not only China, I mean, Iran. Lebanon had a fuel crisis last month, and Iran offered to sell Lebanon fuel, and they would accept the local currency because everyone else only accepts dollars, and Lebanon has a dollar shortage. So rather than say yes when they were desperate for fuel, the pro-American bloc in Lebanon refused. So like there's huge obstacles to even if Lebanon wanted to turn east. That's what I'm saying. It's like this tension between East and West. American allies on the ground will not allow it on behalf of America.
Yeah, I think Lebanon is actually one of the countries listed as a participant in the Belt and Road Initiative. I'm not sure how far that's gone, but it means that there's at least been some talk between Lebanese business interests and perhaps the government with the Chinese in that development project. People are asking about the constitutional crisis in Lebanon, the fact that the government resigned in the wake of this blast. What happens next? It seems like they might just put a Band-Aid over the situation since there are such deep structural issues here.
So just to be clear, the whole government didn't resign. It was just the prime minister and his cabinet. So like the parliament still exists as it was,
but the ministers, that's what
the ministers who are in the cabinet resigned, like in the government, in the prime minister's cabinet, they all resigned. So they're in caretaker capacity, and they'll stay in caretaker capacity until the president, who's still in his position, and other power players are able to negotiate a new government. And of course, the U.S. is jumping in and trying to influence who's in the new government, just like they did last year. So last year, when there was these massive protests, Saud Hariri, the then prime minister, who's head of the Future Movement, which is a Saudi-backed, American-backed party, he resigned and called him. He like joined the protest, and his constituents joined the protest, which helped hijack it. And so after his resignation, a new government, cabinet and prime minister needed to be appointed. And the U.S. tried to, influence that by pushing through its local proxies this idea of a technocratic, non-political government. And it kind of worked, but kind of didn't. Like the U.S. sort of failed. And so now they're like repeating the cycle again. The government that was appointed was a technocratic government. But it was a technocratic government that was approved by Hezbollah and its allies. So like they weren't acting against Hezbollah and its allies. So the U.S., it didn't work. And so they're going to try again, and they're probably going to fail again. But the difference now is Lebanon is in a much more vulnerable position. And like the economy's collapsing, the port is gone, and the international community led by the U.S. is likely going to try and condition desperately needed aid on like Lebanon's government being shaped in the image the U.S. wants. And if that doesn't happen, then the people there will suffer. That seems to be like the plan. I don't know if that'll play out that way, but that seems to be at least what the Trump administration wants.
I saw a comment that I wanted to respond to, which is someone saying, aren't Russia and China allies of Israel or in bed with Israel and make them a Trojan horse in the context of discussing the Belt and Road Initiative, or asking whether or not Lebanon should look to Russia and China as the United States continues to just assault them economically. And at least I'll make my point quick, which is that Russia, it has a deep relationship with Israel for historic reasons. There are a lot of Russian Jews in Israel. They have served in the government. And Russia has shown still that, for example, in Syria, it was willing to intervene on the side opposite of Israel and provided weapons, which, for example, led to Israeli jets getting shot out of the sky, even though some people complain that Russia hasn't supported Syria or given the level of weapons that it needed because of its alliance with Israel. Russia definitely plays a balance in terms of playing the adult in the room, trying to negotiate between parties such as Israel and Syria. But it definitely, when push came to shove, showed that it's not just going to bend to the will of the Israelis. And as for China, China has business interests as a business relationship with the Israelis, but most importantly, it has a blanket policy of non-interference in the internal affairs of countries, including Israel. So that's why you don't hear China making loud statements or denouncing Israel, but you see at the United Nations, China and Russia vote along the lines of international law and norms when it comes to Israel, unlike the United States, which will veto basic denunciations of Israeli illegal settlement activity in the West Bank. And so I wouldn't say that China and Russia are in bed with Israel to the point that they wouldn't be an honest partner to Lebanon, just because, especially China, it's just very consistent in its policy of non-interference. And so while people might want it to wield its weight around or its strength a bit more aggressively and make a case for Palestine, I just don't think that that's the Chinese nature or the Chinese way. I don't know if you had anything you wanted to add to that, Rania.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I think it's an issue of ideology versus like the U.S. is ideologically attached to Israel. And Israel is like a kind of like a satellite extension of the U.S. in so many ways in the region. And there is a difference between that relationship and the relationship Russia and China have with Israel, which you described really well. Like they have ties with Israel like they do any other country, but it's not an ideological tie. And it's not a tie that would necessarily prevent China from doing business with a country Israel doesn't like. And they also, you mentioned non-interference. Like, I think it's important to understand about Russia and China, especially when it comes to the Middle East, they're not so much, especially China, about interfering in internal. It's not about meddling in internal affairs like the U.S. does. It's about,
contrary to what you may hear some leftists say, they're not empires.
No, neither is Russia. Like, Russia's a little bit different, like in Syria, because its relationship in Syria is all tied up together in various ways. But like Russia's relationship with Iran and Lebanon and all of these other countries in the Middle East, okay, maybe Libya is a different story, but that's complicated in another way. But the point is like the relationships that Russia and China have with countries isn't one of domination. So I wouldn't think like China and Russia aren't going to be going around to other countries to benefit Israel. Like, they go around and have relationships with other countries to benefit themselves and to benefit international security. So I think that's the lens you have to look at that through. Like, and there's no evidence that's ever happened where like Russia or China has like, because they both have a close relationship with Iran in many ways. And that hasn't like been impacted by also having a relationship with Israel. But I think you explained it like really well. I agree with everything you said.
And I think as the world changes and lines are drawn more clearly, especially as the United States continues its really aggressive financial policy with regard to the Middle East, that China will be forced a bit more to, well, look at this deal that they're supposedly negotiating with Iran. It would be monumental. It's a multi-billion-dollar trade and military agreement that the Chinese and Iranians are supposedly discussing. We've only seen drafts, parts of the agreement here and there, but I think that would be a monumental, or would signify a monumental shift in the region. And if the United States continues this maximum pressure campaign on Lebanon, perhaps it's only a matter of time before people start to recognize China as an emerging force that can offer assistance to countries targeted by U.S. financial terror in this way. I'm seeing a comment. Someone said, Rania, love your work. I learned so much from you, especially when it comes to Middle East. Every time I share your videos, I get attacked on social media.
By who? I want to know by who. I want names.
Um,
Attacked how though? I'm curious. Is it because of the label on my videos, or is it just because it's me?
yeah, talk about that, Rania. Now, are you worried that you're going to get labeled as affiliated with Russian state media personally? This is what, 2 weeks ago, Twitter rolled out these new rules labeling in the now, labeling RT, labeling Chinese media, only Chinese and Russian state media as state media, not the BBC, not Al
Mm-hmm.
Jazeera, not France 24,
Not Voice of America.
not Voice of America, not think tanks,
Nope.
various think tanks and their fellows, which are crawling all over Twitter. And they claim that's because they only targeted state media outlets which don't enjoy editorial freedom.
Yeah, so let me just clarify a couple things. The outlet I work for is called Mafic, and it's like the parent company of Soapbox and In the Now, and another channel we have called Wasted, which does like environmental sustainability. Which, anyways, the we used to be like a part of Ruptly, like we used to be half owned by Ruptly. So now since last year the company I work for is no longer half owned by Abruptly. It's now an American company that's fully owned by my boss, Anissa Nawe. So legally speaking, in the technical sense, as far as like evidence goes, like it's not even correct to call us Russian state media. But regardless, so that's like a different issue where we're suing Facebook right now over that label because Facebook right now has us labeled as well as like RT and other RT affiliates labeled as Russia, not just Russia's affiliated media, Russia's state controlled media. And if you hover over the little like information thumb like a button on that label, it's like a scare label. It says this media outlet, something along the lines of this media outlet is under the editorial control of either a government or state officials, which is like completely false and defamatory and actually isn't even true about RT. I mean, you were at RT. RT is not under the control of government and state officials. Like it's just an absurd thing to say that clearly the Atlantic Council came up with and Facebook just like decided to stamp on whatever the Atlantic Council told them
And
to.
Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the
Cheerleaded it.
yeah,
She
she led
applauded.
it really, this initiative in
Yeah.
Congress. I remember watching her roast Mark Zuckerberg, the Facebook founder and CEO, as well as other heads of social media outlets, and really press them on why they weren't labeling misinformation, why they weren't doing more to crack down on speech. And I was actually very sad because I saw a lot of people who think they're progressive or view themselves as progressive celebrating her questioning, but I was actually relieved that Mark Zuckerberg didn't see himself as God or someone that should be deciding what's true and what's false. They do this under the guise of combating right-wing conspiracy theories, but we know, Rania, that that's a slippery slope. That's why I oppose the censorship of Alex Jones and the removal of
Yeah.
his YouTube channel from YouTube, because that's how they start. And then before you know it, we know that the Atlantic Council is designing this program, so their targets aren't really going to be right wingers. Even if they were, that would be wrong. Their targets are narratives that challenge U.S. empire.
Yeah, 100%. And it's just like it's completely outrageous. It's a double standard. And the Twitter label, Twitter, I think, has been more resistant to this. It's so like the last big social media company that finally just like submitted, because initially it was YouTube, right, with the scare label of like this is affiliated with a government that only applies really to RT and CGTN, and then you get to like or you get to like BBC, and it's like the BBC is funded in whole or in part by the British public, and you're like, wait, what? Like it's like they get like a different special label that makes them sound innocent, even though their structure is exactly the same as RT.
Yeah,
But
no one ever says Russian public funded.
no, of course not. Exactly, no one ever says Russian public funding, although that essentially is what it is. But um, with Twitter, they put like Russia state affiliated. So it's not as bad as Russia state controlled. But then Twitter like gave like a press release to go along with this new labeling system where they explicitly say like they're basically arbitrarily deciding what outlets this applies to. So far, it only applies to RT and like my outlet. and
CGTN,
CGTN, and then they
Xinhua.
actually defend not labeling the BBC by saying outlets like the BBC and NPR are not under the editorial control of any government, even if they receive government funding. So they don't count.
Just
And like,
go ahead.
it's like, well, it's a completely subjective and arbitrary. They don't have any evidence for any of that. Like I don't, I don't know, like nobody's on the internal side of the BBC to really know if the government is telling them what to say or not, but they're just deciding that because that's what the Atlantic Council told them. Like, it's completely outrageous and it's a double standard. And at the end of the day, it just shows how terrified, like how terrified do you have to be that scared of any narrative that challenges mainstream discourse?
Well, they know
because
they're
that's ultimately what this is. It's a scare label. It's like a warning label to scare people from watching the content. Don't watch this. It's disinformation, without ever watching it. And I think it's a slippery slope because, my outlet is in a weird position because we were attached to Rupley, but now we're not, and we're trying to prove that we're not because according to evidence, we're not. But because of the past relationship, like Facebook can just say, well, you have a past relationship with them. But who's to stop Facebook or Twitter from calling any outlet whatever they want to call it? Because this is not having to be based on any proof. And, like the Grayzone, for example, like there are attempts to smear the Grayzone as being funded by this or that state, whether they say it's Venezuela or China or Russia. The Grayzone is constantly being accused of being funded by the state. The Grayzone has made some really big enemies, like people on the Atlantic Council. And so who's to stop a couple of years from now, like these so Silicon Valley companies submitting to, like, okay, we'll label the Grayzone as disinformation.
Yeah.
Like what, like how long until that happens?
There was just a slanderous article with heavy-handed implications. Really no journalism was done, but at Axios.com, which tried to imply because Chinese diplomats share Grayzone articles that the Grayzone is a Chinese information operation. We don't take money from any state. And that's always been the case because that's the only thing people ever say in order to delegitimize our work, since they can't argue with the facts of the articles we put out. So the only thing that they say is that we're funded by these governments and that's what motivates us to do our work, because if they can only imagine people to be motivated by getting paid. They don't think that they don't understand that we're motivated by principle, and also because there aren't very many people shining the light on the wrongdoings of U.S. empire and trying to poke holes in the mainstream narrative. You can find people doing the opposite for a dime a dozen, but we're trying to fill a void, as you are as well. And so that's what motivates us. It's not a paycheck. I think we can
and like a deep sense of like passion about like injustice.
Yeah, we could all get paid way more if we were sellouts, or if we
100%.
tried to chase corporate media jobs, but it's just not really our thing. And I want to just make the point, because this frustrated me especially, that Al Jazeera didn't end up getting labeled when everything else did, because there was actually a clear, naked example of the Qatari government, the Qatari monarchy, I should say, intervening in Al Jazeera's broadcasting when Al Jazeera censored a documentary about the Israel lobby. It had released one that it filmed with an undercover reporter about the UK and the role of the Israeli government in smearing, trying to really sow discord within the Labour Party and smear people as anti-Semites. And they filmed a separate documentary with another individual undercover in the United States who got access to one of the top Israel lobbying groups in Washington, D.C., and filmed evidence documenting the relationship between the Israeli embassy and some of these lobbying firms, none of which are, of course, registered under the Foreign Agents Registration Act, because you don't have to do that if you're affiliated with Israel, only if you're affiliated with China and Russia. But this documentary, everyone knew it was coming out. People were waiting for it to come out. And because of threats from the Trump administration, the Qatari government pulled the plug on this documentary. And so that was a clear example, just blatant example of the
and it's not the only one, by the way. Like I have friends at a lot of different outlets, and I think that the Al Jazeera is probably the one that I've heard the most stories about government intervening, in towing a certain line, or in shutting down certain programming because of a certain opinion.
It's also the most authoritarian and evil government out of any of the ones that people criticize.
Yeah,
that's monarchy.
Actually, yeah. It's a literal monarchy that has like slaves. Like actual
but
slaves.
It's acceptable to work for them, and fine. I know great journalists who work for them, but what you're saying is true.
Probably because like Qatar like hosts the U.S. Navy's Fifth Fleet, probably helps make it an okay outlet. And it supports America's regime change agenda almost everywhere.
Yeah, just as the Qatari government does. Yeah, exactly. So what you're saying is true, and I don't even want to. I respect some people. I
respect a lot. Like we know people who work at Al Jazeera, and I don't not respect them.
I just knock them for taking
talking about the outlet. The outlet itself got away from this without being labeled, which just shows you how arbitrarily and cynically and specifically it's being applied to people that the Atlantic Council doesn't like. And I did tell you, like when I saw you like earlier this week, that another fear I have is like Twitter actually wrote that it had also labeled big name journalists or high like editorial staff as Russia state affiliated who work at these outlets they labeled. So like, what does that mean for someone like me? Does that mean because my outlet was labeled, they're eventually going to label me, even though I'm an American citizen who works for several outlets, which is like a way to destroy someone's career? Does that mean if somebody goes on RT or goes on CGTN, they're going to be labeled as China state affiliated or Russia state affiliated? Like, where does it stop? This is like actually I think a really scary slope, not just a slippery slope, a scary slope where like we're just going to have to start wearing scarlet letters.
And who spoke out about this, Rania?
No one. Oh my God, like no one. I was really shocked by that. Like except for our circle of like colleagues, nobody really spoke out. Nobody cared. Even people I would have expected to care.
After the cancel culture outrage too.
After the cancel culture outrage, because this is like acceptable cancel culture. Yeah. It's acceptable to cancel people. And by the way, I just want to be clear, like, even if I worked for RT right now, I wouldn't be ashamed of it, like, at all. If I worked for Al Jazeera, I wouldn't be ashamed of it. If I worked for the BBC, I wouldn't be ashamed of it. Like, I don't like this dehumanization of journalists who work for bad outlets, like, considered bad by the state of America. Like, it's like, and that's what it does. It actually is dehumanizing. I feel like as a person and as a journalist, I've been dehumanized by this entire campaign that like labels me an asset of another country. Like I'm a worker just like anybody else. And I like feel lucky to even have a job right now, considering how many like media jobs have been massacred by corporate media over the last like several years, including this last year because of COVID. Yeah. Like people are lucky to have jobs if they have them. Now they're supposed to like limit their pool of jobs they can have because of Twitter and Facebook labeling, because that's essentially what it's doing. It's completely outrageous.
Yeah, and as someone who did work for RT for several years, the one thing that I never really understood is why, of course, why is working for RT worse than working for BBC? Whatever, that's one level. But why is working for any state worse than working for corporate media?
Right.
Look at the evil corporations should we start putting Comcast sponsored media under Jake Tapper's Twitter handle? Like why?
Or like pharmaceutical company sponsored.
Yeah, or arms industry sponsored think tank. I can think of some people in media who work at some arms industry sponsored think tanks and they don't get any labels.
Nope. Because it's totally acceptable. Corporations are fine. Weapons companies are fine. Working at the Center for American Progress that was taking money from the UAE is fine. Like, that's totally acceptable. Like, this is just such a double standard. It's so much hypocrisy and it's so disgusting. And I'm just like, the people who are leading it are like sick authoritarians that are they're sick authoritarian tools of empire. Like,
Totally.
they're the most authoritarian people imaginable. They spend all their time freaking out when any country near Russia, like that borders Russia, behaves badly. It's like the biggest authoritarian problem in the world, and we have to intervene. But they themselves are like shutting down speech and literally adding warning labels to outlets and people.
Yep.
It's disgusting.
Yeah, it just says a lot, again, that after all this really phony outrage over cancel culture, that people who claim to stand for free speech and the free internet just were completely silent on this, and also that progressives such as AOC were the ones responsible for ramming this down Twitter's throat. I guess my final thoughts on this is what I've thought for a long time is that Twitter and YouTube and Facebook all need to be publicly traded and owned companies, because then the Constitution, there's like a double-edged argument here. One is that people who I'm sympathetic to or I agree with say, well, our problem is that we don't want the U.S. government deciding or having so much control over these outlets that they can suppress voices such as ours, because that's
but
what
they legally
do.
can't.
But
they legally can't.
If it was a publicly owned company, the Constitution would actually apply, and then you could have more stable grounds to challenge your rights to not be censored, your rights to not be labeled in court. And right now, it's not as easy to do that, because technically Facebook and Twitter, they can do whatever the fuck they want.
They're private companies. So they can do whatever they want. They can say whatever they want about you. They can call you a Nazi. Let's have some Nazi stickers.
Right.
Like let's have some, Stalinist. Let's start having tanky stickers. Yeah. Like I could totally see that being a thing. So let's have a tanky tag.
I just want to encourage viewers one more time to submit comments. That's why I'm always looking down at the screen. I'm trying to see what you guys are saying. And I appreciate all of you for tuning in. But I guess, Rania, we should probably touch on as a half Indian American, I was really excited this week when Joe Biden selected Kamala Harris. Kamala, I guess everybody's upset that people weren't saying her name right, even though I definitely thought it was Kamala, and it seems weird to be like Kamala, but
wait, I didn't hear this. Wait, what? People were upset her name was being pronounced wrong?
CNN did this whole article saying it's like Kamala. And
wait, what?
Yeah, I think they were mainly mad at Tucker Carlson for saying Kamala, but everybody that I know says that. So
wait, I thought it was Kamala.
It's Kama. It's like Kamala.
Kamala.
Also in her Twitter bio, she says she's a mamala.
I saw that.
And she's
she her. Yeah, as if anybody thought, as if anybody thought that they needed to know her gender pronoun.
It's just a way of virtue signaling to like a very small group of people who think that is important. But yeah, anyway, a victory for Indian Americans.
I think you have a good take on this, because like we talked about this previously. I think you have a really good take on how, before we get into what's wrong with Kamala, politically, I think this was a strategically bad decision, and I think that you have the right take on that. So why don't you give us a rundown of why it was a strategically bad decision?
That's what really confused me the most about this Kamala selection. I'm from Michigan. I was just in Michigan visiting my family. My family lives in Ann Arbor, but we went outside of Ann Arbor occasionally to go to the lake, and I have friends who work outside of Ann Arbor, and they are not as convinced as many of the people that I speak with that Biden has this in the can, that there's no way, because of coronavirus and everything that's happened, especially in the last few months, that Trump is going to lose. Trump is still very much alive in Michigan, parts that I saw, and that's really the territory that whoever's going to win needs to walk away victorious. That's the make or break. That's a make or break state, and the Midwest from Pennsylvania to Ohio is really the make or break region, and especially the demographic of people who voted for Obama in 2008 and 2012, but then voted for Trump 4 years later. And so many people, I think, lose track of the fact that's like a large percentage of the population. I think especially liberals in the Hillary camp and now Biden camp tend to write off all Trump supporters as just racist pieces of shit that they don't even need to bother courting. And you're not going to win with that mentality. The reality is not everyone who voted for Trump is someone that you have to or can afford to write off. That's how he won. He won by winning these states where Hillary, or a Democrat, I shouldn't say Hillary because she was such a bad candidate, but a Democrat could have won. Bernie, I think, could have won in those states up against Trump. And so what do they do now, 4 years later after Hillary Clinton, when they know, or they should know, again, this is the demographic, working class, disaffected people in the middle of the country. These are the hearts they need to win over in order to win the White House in 2020. And they pick a Democrat from California who not only, it just doesn't make any sense because California, I mean, for decades, it's just been common sense political knowledge that you pick a candidate from a state that you need to win or that brings something to the table. And as a Democrat, California does nothing. California was going to be comfortable for Biden. And most importantly, Kamala Harris was not liked at all during the primary earlier this year. She had to drop out of the race before Obama even intervened and got Amy Klobuchar and Pete Buttigieg to drop out. She was already unable to raise money and enthusiasm. I think even for Black millennials, I was speaking with a friend last night who pointed out she was like the fourth choice for Black millennials, even after Sanders and Warren, because people just don't like her. She's so unlikable. There's that famous clip I think everyone's seen of Tulsi Gabbard, who really tore her a new one during the debate and pointed out her terrible prosecutorial record. Someone who sent thousands of people to jail for smoking marijuana, someone who kept people in over their sentences in order to keep cheap prison labor available in the state of California. It's an insult, honestly, that especially in the wake of these unprecedented protests against police brutality, that they literally chose a cop. I've seen a lot of people make that comment, and it's just obvious to people like us that she brings nothing to the table. She adds insult to injury, and she's really not appealing to people in the middle of the country who I just think the Democrats hate. I mean, it used to be their base, these people, and they're just saying, we don't even care about you. We're not even going to try to pretend to care about you. We're just going to stay in our little coastal enclaves. And I don't know, maybe they don't want to win, Rania. I don't know what your take is.
I agree with what you're saying. I don't understand either on a strategic level for all the reasons you mentioned. She did so poorly in the Democratic primary. I mean, there are people excited about her, but for those are people who were already going to vote Democrat. And even if the Democrats hate middle America, forget the politics of it, right? They still need them to win. Why did Trump win in 2016? Because we have a stupid electoral college system that you have to win certain strategic states in order to win. And he won those states. He won Michigan, he won Pennsylvania, he won Ohio. Kamala Harris isn't going to help Joe Biden win those states. I don't know what they were thinking. I mean, Joe Biden still will likely win. Maybe the only thing I can think is maybe they thought that Trump is so hated, there's no way he can win again, that they don't have to pick somebody that can be strategic. And then I assume they were also picking somebody that they can rely on to be a hawk if Joe Biden has to step down from presidency because he's mentally incapacitated. which is a real possibility if
Yeah,
they
he
do
might not
win.
even live. He's not doing
Yeah.
well. I think it's disgusting that his family's kept him in the race or that anybody
Yeah.
has. But she could very well end up, if they win,
Be
our
president.
first woman president by default.
And
And
I just like I can't get it. Look, I understand the symbolism that people got excited about, but like I can't get excited about that when somebody is such a hawk and is so awful. Like
and
I
did
care about
terrible things for
policy.
black people.
I care about policy. This woman threatened to imprison the mothers of children who skipped school. Like how am I supposed to
And
be
she laughed
excited for
about
someone
it
like
and with
that?
her cackle, like,
Yeah. How am I supposed to be excited for that? Like, no, that's horrible.
yeah.
Like, everything that you described that you went through was horrible. Steve Mnuchin, who everybody hates, who's a Treasury Secretary, uh, he made a shit ton of money foreclosing on people after the financial crisis of 2008. He like bought some local bank or what they considered a community bank and then used it to foreclose on people across California. And what he did, part of it seemed to have been illegal. There was like a class action against him, and he got out of it because Kamala Harris refused to prosecute. Like, Steve Mnuchin got away with that because she refused to prosecute. So, like, it's pretty clear to me whose side she's on in almost every fight just based on that,
And
you
she'll
know?
just be a yes woman to
The national security
Susan
state.
Rice will probably be
Yeah.
Secretary of State, if not Samantha Power. All these ghouls and demons from the Obama era, and I mean, I'm just not convinced that the Democrats have this race in the bag now. I wasn't before, but I'm especially not convinced now. I, I guess we'll see. I wonder if because of coronavirus, if there's just going to be a lack of voter enthusiasm and turnout because there's nothing really to be excited about. But I also have this feeling that I've been entertaining for a while, this theory that the Democrats don't actually want to win. They don't want to govern because, first of all, they don't actually want to give their base any of the things that their base wants: healthcare, student debt relief, anything progressive. They don't want to do that. They had the chance under Obama, an unprecedented green light to move ahead with real progressive policies, and that's the last thing they want to do. Unlike Republicans, who actually do give their base what they want when they're in power. Democrats don't want to do that, so governing isn't actually very fun for them. And they also, more importantly, under Trump, they just get to be a permanent opposition party, raise a ton of money, engage in theatrical politics without passing any meaningful legislation whatsoever. And when they make a choice like choosing Kamala Harris for the vice presidential nominee, I just like, maybe they don't want to win. Maybe they're just not interested in actually
Maybe they
getting into
don't,
power.
like, yeah, maybe they just don't care because either way they win. Like, in their minds, either way they win. Or maybe they're this delusional, or maybe they're just this disconnected from the rest of the country. I don't know what it is, but it's pretty shocking. And I think that, like, we have a better chance under a Biden administration to, like, I feel like the Trump administration has just swallowed up anything progressive and like spit it back out as like hashtag resistance bullshit politics. And I feel like maybe under a Biden that could change. But like either way, I'm like, it's like I saw this poll yesterday. It was from Pew Research. And it was like the top reasons why people are voting for either Trump or Biden. And I think you might have seen it too. It was like 53% of the people who are voting for Biden said they're voting for him because he's not Trump.
Right. That's great.
So
Great sign for Democratic politics.
Yeah, like that's literally what it's about. Like it's just not. It's because it's not Trump, and it's like once again you have the Democratic Party giving you. I think maybe Obama, since Obama, giving you something only to vote against rather than
Yeah.
something to vote for it. Like with Obama, people at least thought they were
They
voting
had
for
hope.
something,
How'd all that
right?
hopey changey stuff work out for you, as Sarah Palin
Oh
would
God,
say?
it didn't work out.
It didn't work out at all, and now I can never believe again. So don't try and fool me.
Yeah, don't try and fool me again.
That's why I didn't. In 2016, I was kind of excited about Sanders. It was nice. It was awesome to have someone making the points that he was making, and I used to watch him all the time on Tom Hartman's show, so it was cool. But especially after he gave up and just played the party's game so clearly in 2016, I was not that confident or excited about him this time around, and he even shattered my very low expectations even more this time.
Oh my God, he even now it's like I feel like Yasha Levine is always every time Bernie Sanders like applauds Joe Biden, he's what does he say? He's like something old man, or like, oh yeah, like lick the boots old man. That's what he's doing.
He congratulated Kamala. It's just pathetic. And I just can't get over the fact that throughout this whole pandemic, he was doing nothing to agitate for single-payer health care. He wasn't even coming down to vote. He didn't vote against the Patriot Act.
He like disappeared.
Meanwhile,
went to sleep.
Tulsi Gabbard was flying all the way from Hawaii to vote against the Patriot Act in the middle of a pandemic. And Bernie, I mean, sure, he's old or whatever, but then just, don't be in government, man.
I mean, he's just like, it was a huge disappointment, and it's like everything that he made popular. I think this is like this is definitely a lesson in sort of like centering your politics around one person. Is it the second that he went away because he dropped out, his movement went away.
Yeah.
Like that's why you can't center a movement around a person.
And what are those people going to do now? I mean, he's going to speak at the convention and get everybody excited for Biden. This was the other thing, they didn't get any influence over the Democratic Party platform. Like they didn't win any concessions,
which is also meaningless, by the way. The platform's meaningless, and they couldn't even get that. Like you can't even get the Democratic Party to give you a symbolic gesture of rhetorical like concessions. That's all that the platform is. It would just be a symbolic gesture of rhetorical concession. You can't even get them to give you that. Like you have no influence. None. The progressive wing of the party has no influence. They're just like hostages, forever hostages.
Yeah, someone mentioned Gloria La Riva of the Party for Socialism and Liberation. I agree. I give her a thumbs up. I will vote for her in Washington, and I personally would vote for her no matter where in the country I lived, because I believe
I really don't want Trump to be president again. I really don't want him to be president again. Like I just can't handle it. I can't handle it. I feel like it's been just such a disaster for the left and for progressive politics in this country. It's made everybody more right wing.
I did not burp, by the way. I don't know why. Someone said I burped, but I did not.
Did I burp?
No.
Anya just burped. That's weird. I didn't hear you burp, but I'm glad that you clarified that you didn't.
Sorry.
Yeah. Well, the point is I'm just like, I don't know. I just hate everything right now.
I just believe in democracy, so I have multiple choices.
I don't. Maybe I don't believe in democracy.
I'm going to vote for
anymore.
the choice that I most relate to if you're going to give me something to vote for.
I think a socialist should be imposed on America.
Okay. Well, that maybe I can. But that's another discussion. Anya, I'm more and more inclined that they want to lose too. Yeah. All right. Well,
what was?
I'm just looking at what people are commenting pretty quickly, so I'm enjoying it. I like seeing what the people.
I like the comments too. People say funny stuff. There's always Kanye.
Yeah, Kanye said that everyone who has a baby should get $1 million.
I'll have like 5.
Yeah, I mean, it would still be probably. How many people are there in the United States? Like, I'm gonna look that up. 350 million
or something, or 320 million.
Isn't that like if every person got $1 million, wouldn't that still be way less than our military budget?
Yeah. That wouldn't even be $1 billion.
I know. It's crazy.
That wouldn't even be like how much. That's like nothing.
I know they could make everybody a millionaire. So I'm like, maybe I will vote for Kanye. No, I feel bad. I think he's mentally ill, and
he definitely is.
I feel bad.
He's definitely mentally ill.
Please don't have
Tell
five
us.
babies. Why can't Putin pay me?
I think it's funny that no matter who wins, like the other side will have a story about foreign interference. Like they're saying that if Biden wins, it's because China
Oh,
intervened,
right.
which I think is really funny. And if Trump wins, then Russia will have intervened. But the funniest of all that is like if you really cared about election meddling, then you would actually look internally because don't we like disenfranchise voters?
Yeah. Oh,
And
exactly.
isn't Trump trying to like not fund the postal service so that we can't do mail-in ballots?
Yeah. They're like
Um,
shutting them down.
yes, it's like no, it's I just the way that the elites of this country think is so insane. Like I think they believe what they say,
Mm-hmm.
and they actually believe they're like brains are like having like a short circuit because of the intelligence reports
Mm-hmm.
saying that China wants Biden to win but Russia wants Trump to win.
Some
And like
Someone said they would vote for Tulsi, and I also would vote for
oh,
Tulsi.
we're really sweet. What? 320 million times 1 million. Yeah, we're really I don't hold on. I this actually confused me before.
No, just if every one person got $1 million. Did we do the math incorrectly?
We may well someone's confusing me. It would be 300 billion?
Oh, because you times it by a million. Fuck it.
Yeah, fuck it. But I guess no, they're right. If you gave everybody $1, it would be 320
Oh
million.
man, see,
We're
that's
really
why I'm a
I've done this.
journalist.
I've made this mistake before.
That's why
It's like
I'm a
it's
journalist.
a
I can't
gotcha.
do
It's a
math.
gotcha question.
Tulsi
That's
was
why
the
yeah,
best
that's why
candidate in the race by a mile. Yeah, I mean, I honestly think
it's
Tulsi.
320 it's 330
I think.
trillion.
Oh fuck. Well, still,
Yeah, we
that's
were
like
like really off.
that's still nothing compared to what we spent on our military over like several years. So
Yeah, I guess
we might
not.
as well just still make everybody a
We should
millionaire.
just do it. Yeah.
Um, I think Tulsi was actually a really better. I think she'd have way more appeal than Biden on the It's like if she could have gotten out of the corrupt Democratic Party
Did
race, which is impossible, on the national stage against Trump, she would have been baller.
did Kamala? I'm like never gonna say her name normal again.
Kamala.
Did Kamala? Um, did she ever even pull? Like, did she ever even get more votes than Tulsi
I
got?
don't think so.
Like, because I remember one time when after Tulsi attacked her, she like went on MSNBC and was like, "Look, a lot of us top tier candidates are just targets for attack by those in the bottom tier."
Oh right,
And then
yeah, as if
ultimately
she was top.
Kamala, she didn't even like
A
get
lot
enough votes
of and
to.
her voice is like that. She's like a lot of us on the top tier. I can't stand her.
A lot of us. Yeah, she has a very nasally voice. I do like her
She
hair.
never
She has
got
good hair.
yeah, she does. She's a good looking lady.
It's like, well, her hair's thick and like beautiful. And she's good looking. I don't like her
Obama
voice.
said she was the most good looking prosecutor or something like that. He like made a
That's probably true. That's probably true. Because prosecutors look like Janet
She
Reno.
looks really hot when she throws black people in jail.
Yeah, I mean, there's probably some weird like fetish, like Pornhub fetish of
Of
Kamala
Kamala.
Harris, like someone who looks like Kamala Harris, like all dressed up, ready to like put like black people in bondage.
Oh my god.
I mean, I could imagine because like there was like Sarah Palin had like all these porn videos made about her.
Sarah Palin was hot though.
Yeah, she totally was. And I actually do think Kamala Harris is like really, really good looking for like politicians are not usually good looking.
No.
So there's that, I guess. I can appreciate when a woman is attractive, I suppose. But beyond that, I mean, she's just got disgusting policies. And, she's like, I think on almost every national security issue, it's not like the thing she's known for, but she refused to vote for the amendment or the Biden, I'm sorry, not Biden. Wow. The Bernie Sanders attempt to cut the military budget by 10%. Yep. She didn't vote. She voted against it. And she even said she voted against it because of the way it was done, not because she's necessarily against cutting the budget. So she's one of these people who always does the most hawkish thing while making an excuse for why she couldn't be more progressive.
Yeah. I'm just laughing because so many people are commenting and they're saying they agree with me that Sarah Palin was hotter than Kamala Harris. but that she's no Tulsi, which is true. Tulsi, I think, wins.
Well, I think that's because Kamala Harris it doesn't have a good
No,
personality.
it's
Like
terrible.
she's I mean she's like physically attractive, but she doesn't have the charisma to make her like magnetically attractive. Whereas even though Sarah Palin was really stupid, she was charming.
Yeah. Oh
Like
yeah.
she was very very
Very
charming. You
charming,
wanted
you
to
know.
watch her. Like even if she was being like a total doofus and you hated her, you wanted to watch her.
Yeah.
You know?
Oh
There was
yeah,
something
she was freaking
compelling.
entertaining.
There was
So,
something entertaining but also compelling. She like reeled you in, you know, even if you were like this
oh
woman's crazy
yeah.
and stupid. Oh yeah.
All right.
Oh yeah.
Are there any final questions or comments that people want to make? Rania, anything you want to add? We should probably wrap soon.
Well, somebody who actually donated money, thank you for that, had asked about an international investigation in
Oh
Lebanon and
yeah.
like what that means. I don't think there's ever going to be like a trustworthy investigation into what happened. If it's a local investigation by the Lebanese, it certainly won't be trustworthy because it'll be every person in power trying to like wash their hands of responsibility. And if it's an outside investigation, I would just be concerned that the U.S. will try to like meddle in it and try and pin the blame on Hezbollah when there's no way Hezbollah like there of all the parties in Lebanon, Hezbollah is the least corrupt and the least responsible specifically for this port incident. So just to answer that for the person that so kindly
Someone
uh
asked if we've heard of the Zeitgeist movement. Yeah, I have.
I
I
thought
think
at first second I thought it said Rania and Anya, are you the head of the Zeitgeist movement? I was like, what?
I've heard of it. I've watched some of the videos. I think uh, Peter Joseph and the movement are pretty good at describing some of the problems in society, but I just think I'm good with my classic like Marx and Lenin understanding of the world and capitalism. I think I don't really need to go beyond that because a lot of it was already broken down like 100 years ago. Capitalism's bad, guys.
Very bad. Someone else asked if Biden wins and re-enters the Iran deal, will Biden stop the oil stealing in Syria by the SDF, or will it keep going? I think that'll keep going. What do you
Yeah,
think?
well, I mean, if the architects of the Syria war get back into power, I'm very worried. I mean, Susan Rice will want to finish what she started.
Oh God, in Libya's like a huge mess now too. It's like 10 countries are involved in Libya, but we can talk about that another time.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Okay.
okay, well, wait. One person actually, I do want to address one thing. One person said to me, Rania, you said Hezbollah was corrupt on video. Can you expand? I didn't say Hezbollah is corrupt. I actually in my video say Hezbollah is the least corrupt party. Um, I the point I was making was that Hezbollah has been in government since 2005, and the parties that they're aligned with to create a majority coalition are as corrupt as the pro-American parties. So that in and of itself makes Hezbollah in a way complicit in the corruption problem because they haven't really done anything to push back against the corruption of their own allies, which has made the Lebanese state so like weak. And
would they be able to be in the government still if they did that?
I mean, I think they could. That's a good discussion to have. Like, it's like they made a compromise, and the whole role of Hezbollah being in government is to protect their weapons so that they can't be disarmed, right? Because their weapons are integral in their minds to protecting the country, which is true. So to them, they made a calculation of like, we're just here to protect our weapons. We're not here to change the government, you know, or reform the government. But ultimately, like, and because Hezbollah's whole role is to protect Lebanon from existential threats. But I think that this port explosion shows that the corruption in the country and like the theft of public funds and just the nature of like the dysfunction that is attached to those things is also an existential threat to the country. And Hezbollah should treat it as an existential threat, just like it treats jihadis and just like it treats Israel. Because the damage that port explosion did, like Israel didn't do that. Like Israel, I really don't think Israel did that. And the jihadis didn't do that. Like the internal dynamics of Lebanon's dysfunctional state did that. So at the very least, I think Hezbollah needs to like make that a part of their mission of protecting Lebanon's sovereignty is not just we fight the jihadis in Syria, we fight Israel, but like the internal corruption is just clearly as much of an existential threat, especially since like it's um it's like given a nod by Hezbollah's enemies. Like that's, you know, even Hezbollah's allies get away with that. Like their corruption is a part of a system that Hezbollah's enemies helped impose on the country, if that makes sense. So maybe I should have clarified that a little bit more, but I don't really like, I think I actually defended Hezbollah quite a bit in my video. Uh, and I think it's okay to like have that conversation. It doesn't mean Hezbollah is like bad or shouldn't be in government or Hezbollah's at fault. I explicitly say this was not Hezbollah's fault. Um, but they can play a role in like the fact that their allies are a part of the problem. They can play a role in trying to change the direction of that. Um, and that's like a broader conversation for another time. But I just saw that person ask that question. I know a lot of people have been asking me that all week. So there's that. Anyway, yeah. Yeah. Thanks, everyone. This was fun.